This is Todd Satterston from Astronaut Projects, and you're listening to episode 2 of the Better Books podcast. In this episode, I talk with Dan Ward. He's the author of F.I.R.E, How Fast, Inexpensive, Restrained, and Elegant Methods Ignite Innovation. Dan spent 20 years in the public sector working on large projects in the Air Force and at NASA, and I think he's got a great take on innovation. We talk about how to think about it differently and what applications might there be in the world of book publishing. Take a listen. Dan, the first thing that I thought would be interesting to talk about is if you could talk a little bit about these big, complicated, complex systems that you've been working on throughout your career, both for Department of Defense, for NASA, and just give a sense of the scope of work that you've worked in, over the course of your career.
Yeah, sure. So I spent a little over 20 years in uniform as an active duty Air Force officer. I was specifically an acquisitions officer or a military technologist. And my job was to help shepherd the development of new technology systems. So contractors and other companies are the ones who actually write the code and bend the metal. I'm the one who sort of sits in between the operators, the people who fly the aircraft or operate the technology and the systems, and the people who design and build and make them. So my job was to help translate requirements, help oversee development and testing, that kind of thing. And I had a pretty broad range of experience with a lot of different technologies. I started off doing research in a laser lab, so shooting lasers at things and trying to burn them up, which is ironically a bit less interesting than it sounds, because the first time you shoot the laser is pretty exciting. The 100th time you push the button and the laser goes off, it's a little bit less exciting. So I did some satellite work, some lasers, a lot of IT systems, so big, complex kind of global communication networks for disseminating information and messages, as well as imagery and different forms of military intelligence. And then I did some work on kind of smaller projects where it was a quick and dirty, quick development, quick prototype, field something on a short timeline with a tight budget, a small team. And I discovered this pattern that kept popping up. All my biggest frustrations and failures were when I was part of a cast of thousands spending decades and billions, building a big, expensive, complicated thing. All my proudest moments, all my biggest successes, where I had the biggest impact on military operations and just the most successful delivery of anything, was when I had no time, no money, building a really simple system with a tiny little team, oftentimes just one or two of us. Those are the systems that seem to not only deliver ahead of schedule and under budget, but have the biggest operational impact. We got the most bang for the buck and made the biggest difference for our users, our customers, our warfighters that we were supporting. And I noticed this pattern was pretty consistent in my experience, and I began researching it and looking into, what have other people said about this? What does the literature say about this? And discovered that, in fact, that pattern does seem to hold in my research of other people's research, and then my primary research, my own independent investigations into this, in addition to my experience. And so that kind of got me thinking that, gosh, if our most important, most impactful, most innovative new systems are the result of a small team with a short schedule and a tight budget and a deep commitment to simplicity, gosh, why do we keep building these big teams and huge buckets of money and long timelines and high levels of complexity? And so as I explored these topics and these ideas, I started writing magazine articles about it, and eventually realized I wasn't writing a bunch of magazine articles. I was writing a book, one article at a time. And then, came eventually to this F.I.R.E. book. And then the second book, The Simplicity Cycle, was sort of a spin-off or a related topic, because I felt of the three main topics in this book, speed, thrift, and simplicity, simplicity was the one that was most deserving of that deep dive, the more nuanced investigation into how do we make good decisions about simplicity and complexity and the things we design and make and build. So is that kind of what you were asking?
Yeah, that's perfect. the first question it sort of points me towards, though, is when you describe these two very different buckets of kinds of projects that you worked on, these huge billion-dollar kinds of projects, and then much smaller, much more restrained, constrained by what needed to be done. I guess the first question I'd ask, which I think everybody would wonder, is isn't there something different between those two buckets in terms of what's trying to be accomplished?
I hear that question a lot, and that was sort of my initial impression when I looked back over, maybe these things were big, expensive, and complicated because they had to be,
Right.
because the mission dictated that need. It turns out not to be the case, in my conclusion anyway, and that is a point that not everybody agrees with me on, but my basic conclusion is that the large budgets, the long timelines, and the high levels of complexity, these are not inevitable attributes of a high quality, best in class, or even first in class advanced new piece of technology. And that these big, expensive, complicated, monolithic, really complex systems, there are simpler alternatives. There are simpler ways to accomplish comparable missions. And so the example I use a lot is from the Navy. So the Navy had a nuclear-powered submarine called the Seawolf submarine. And even though it had a really cool name, it was a failed project because the Navy was planning to build 29 of them. They bought 3 of them and then terminated the program because it was taking so long, costing so much, and underperforming. And that's an important point, too, that these big, complicated systems tend to do less than they were designed to do. When we're really ambitious and trying to do a whole lot of stuff, we pile a lot of features and functions and capabilities into our requirements documents and our plans. The product tends to underperform. So having canceled and terminated the Virginia-class submarine system, the Navy still had the need. We still needed the ability to operate under the water. And so they launched a follow-on project called the Virginia-class submarine. Now, nuclear-powered submarines are big, expensive, and complicated by any scale.
Right. Yeah.
And so the Seawolf cost $4.4 billion. The Virginia-class sub only, and I say only with a little asterisk, only cost $2 billion. Now, it would be crazy to call a $2 billion piece of hardware an inexpensive piece of hardware, but it is less than half the price of its predecessors. So this is the simplest, least expensive nuclear-powered submarine you're ever going to find. But what's remarkable about the Virginia-class sub is that they continuously deliver them ahead of schedule and under budget. So it started off with a constrained budget to begin with and a constrained schedule. They said, hey, their motto was 2 for 2 and 2. We're going to have 2 subs every 2 years, $2 billion apiece. That was a very aggressive schedule. That was a very aggressive budget. Again, less than half the cost of its predecessor. And the USS, I think it was the USS Illinois, was the 9th consecutive submarine in this Virginia class of submarines, the 9th consecutive submarine to be delivered ahead of schedule. So they adopted this constrained approach with a relatively small bucket of money and kept spending less than that. And they continue to simplify the design. The Virginia-class sub passed its sea trials. It is a highly capable submarine currently in operation around the world. And I think it not only did it not aim to do less in the strategic sense, it didn't aim to do significantly less than the Seawolf sub. It's actually outperforming its specs. It's doing more than it was designed to do, and that's a very common pattern too. Simple systems tend to do more than they're designed to do. And so how do you do that? How do you get the high level of capability without sacrificing, without it costing billions and billions? Or to flip it the other way around, how do you manage to have a constrained budget, a constrained schedule without sacrificing capability?
Yeah. It feels like the next question that that it leads me towards is how often is it, or I guess another question when I think about these buckets or I think about these comparisons is what I think the question is, I think of technology that is disruptive. It's very different than anything else that's already been tried, been used, versus what you might consider sustaining innovation, right? Something that
Sure.
I've got this, oh, and you know what? I've experience with it, so in each iteration that I'm going to do, it's going to get better and cheaper and, perform better. Really, all the things that you're pointing at. So I guess that would be my next question. Is there any comparison in terms of what it is that people tend to take on between these two buckets of kinds of projects, where things that are open-ended and expensive and things that are constrained but seem to perform better?
Sure.
What can you say about almost the kind of risk, I guess, that the projects are taking on?
Right. Oh, so I think risk as a whole is another piece. So I'll have a little riff on risk in a moment. But
Okay.
you're right. There are two types of innovations we can talk about: sustaining innovations versus disruptive innovations. And with the Virginia class sub, I think you generally do see a sustaining type of innovation. It is we built nuclear powered subs before. This is a less expensive version of one. It does have some new capabilities that the previous ones didn't have. So there is a certain amount of first-in-class type capability, some never been done before, particularly their acoustic sonar system was genuinely new technology that was, to a large extent, without precedent. So you can make advancements in this way, but some of it is just sort of sustaining innovation, and that is, putting existing pieces together in a new and interesting way that gives you a new capability that isn't necessarily drawing from brand new technology. So, for example, when the Virginia was first fielded, it had a $38,000 controller joystick for controlling the periscope. Just this past September, the Navy announced that they were going to replace this $38,000 piece of equipment, which was heavy and clunky. Nobody liked it. It was hard to use. It was just a problematic piece of this submarine. They're replacing it with a $30 Xbox controller, which everybody knows how to use. You can get a spare at any port in the world, and it saves you $38,000 per submarine. And so it's that type of thinking that you can, that type of solution that you uncover when you have a financially constrained mindset. Because one of the key themes in my F.I.R.E. book is that constraints foster creativity. If your goal is to spend a lot of money, you will never get to that Xbox controller. But the Xbox controller doesn't just save $38,000 per submarine. It's better. It performs better. It's easier to use. You don't need to train the sailors on how to use it. Everybody knows how to use an Xbox controller. Mm-hmm. So it is a genuine improvement. But we also see situations where we're trying to do something that's never been done before. And we can do that using the same, what I call the F.I.R.E. method, the fast, inexpensive, restrained, and elegant method. And so a lot of the examples I use for that are from NASA. So, for example, the Near-Earth Asteroid Rendezvous Mission, or NEAR for short. It's one of those acronyms that's kind of nested. So the N in NEAR is near. So this is humanity's first attempt to intercept an asteroid. It's basically hitting a bullet with a bullet. So this asteroid's zipping through the solar system at whatever ungodly speed it's traveling at. And we said, we're going to send a spacecraft on an intercept course. We're going to go into orbit around this asteroid. The asteroid's named Eros, and take some pictures and collect some data about this asteroid. So this is part of NASA's portfolio of faster, better, cheaper missions, where they were explicitly designed with speed, thrift, and simplicity in mind. So we tried to take a very simplified architecture to the system, simplified mission set, simplified procedures, and small teams and a tight budget. So they only used 2/3 of their budget. They had hundreds of millions of dollars left over. They were under budget by hundreds of millions of dollars. Successfully went into orbit around the asteroid, collected 10 times more data than they had envisioned collecting. And having achieved all of their objectives, and with, I believe it was right around $200 million left over, they had a third of their budget left over. I forget the exact number. They decided to land on the asteroid. Now, this spacecraft was not designed to be a lander, but they said, let's go ahead and land on it anyway. So they got the capability in the absence of the mechanism. So this is a simple system that ended up doing more than it was designed to do. And it landed so gently and so softly. It continued to collect and transmit data from 4 inches off the surface of the asteroid for another 2 weeks. And that spacecraft will continue to ride that asteroid until the asteroid crashes into the sun, or crash lands on a planet, or whatever happens to that asteroid. Who knows? But that spacecraft is just going to ride that asteroid indefinitely. The program manager for that system, I read a couple interviews by him, and he said some really interesting stuff. First of all, he kept describing it as a very simple spacecraft. So he said it is important for us to keep this spacecraft's design as simple as possible. Now, it was still like a $250 million spacecraft. But within the context of spaceships, this was a very simple one. And my favorite line in any interview that he gave, he said, "I said no to a lot of good ideas." And I adore that phrase because it's so insightful. It's such a good practice. And it's so human, because when somebody would come up to him and, "Hey, I have a good idea. I want to add some new feature, a new function, or some new capability to this spaceship," he would say, "That's a good idea. I affirm that idea. I value that idea. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm going to have to say no to it. But I'm not saying it's a bad idea. But I'm going to say no because it would cost more, it would take longer, it would add weight, it would add complexity. And gosh, if we spend the time to integrate this new feature, this new capability, we got to do more testing. It increases the complexity of our system, which makes it more fragile because there's more possible failure modes, more things that can go wrong, more things that can break. And the testing for that might take longer. We might miss our launch window. And this asteroid's not going to wait for us. So if we miss the launch window, we're just done." And so although they didn't design it to be a lander, they got the lander capability anyway in the absence of the mechanism. But if they had designed it to be a lander, it would have cost more, taken longer, weighed more, had been more problematic, might have resulted in losing the whole mission. So my contention is that simple systems, as a general rule, tend to be more capable than their more complex alternatives. And that applies even when we're talking about stuff that's never been done before.
Talk to me about risk. You said that you pointed me in a little bit of a different direction. You said, let's talk about risk as something separate.
Yes.
So talk to me about risk.
Yeah, so I have a little riff where I talk about two different kinds of risks, and of course there's probably more than two, but two in particular that I really like talking about. And I talk about optimal risks versus epic risks, or really optimal failures versus epic failures. So these systems can fail in one of two ways. An optimal failure costs a little and teaches a lot. An epic failure costs a lot and teaches a little. So we can't avoid failure entirely. We can't zero out risk. What we can do is decide what types of risks we're going to accept and tolerate and which types of risks we won't tolerate. And that means we can decide what types of failure we can expose ourselves to and what types of failures we will not accept as even a possibility. And so these big, expensive, complicated, monolithic projects, they only fail one way. They only fail epic. So if you spend 20 years and $8 billion developing some new helicopter, for example, as the Army did with the Comanche helicopter, and that helicopter fails, it gets canceled, and we don't have any helicopters to show for it after 20 years and $8 billion, boy, that fails epically. That hurts. It costs a lot, and it doesn't teach us as much because for the 20 years leading up to that cancellation or that failure, we've been chugging along and thinking we're doing good work. This is what right looks like. This is sort of teaching us a lesson of how to do military technology development. And also, by the time we see the end of the story, you really need to see the end of the story before you can learn an appropriate lesson. And if it takes us 20 years to see the end of the story, 20 years to learn that lesson, there's just not a lot of career left for anybody, to sort of apply the lessons to their next project. And the people who are there at the beginning of the project are not there at the end to see the implications of the decisions that they made. They've moved on to other projects. They've probably gotten promoted and moved on to other projects. And so it minimizes our opportunity to learn. But when we have a small team with a short schedule and a tight budget, those projects only fail one way. They only fail optimally. Our exposure to loss is minimal. We haven't invested a ton of time, money, resources, and people into a project. And our opportunity to learn is also maximized because the distance in time between when we start and when we end, or when we make a decision and when we recognize the implications of that decision, by shortening the distance in time between those 2 points, it increases the likelihood that the person who made the decision is also still there to see the results or to see what the outcome is. And it also gives us opportunity. I still have time left in my career because I haven't spent 20 years on this. I've got time left to apply this lesson to my next project. So the F.I.R.E approach, the small, inexpensive, restrained and simple type approach, when it fails, and it certainly fails, because again, we're not going to get risk to zero, but when it fails, it tends to fail optimally, where it costs us a little and teaches us a lot.
So one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to talk to you because I wanted to see if we could take the sorts of things that you've been talking about today and apply this to the wonderful world of book publishing. I've been thinking a lot about lean and agile and fast release, and I guess the question that I would start with is that the first impression, I think anybody who gets close to book publishing, whether I'm an author or I work in book publishing, is that book publishing is a relatively slow process for a whole bunch of reasons. It takes a while to write. Putting stuff out into distribution channels takes a while. Warning the distribution channel that it's coming. To try to take advantage of all of the capabilities that we have within the system, it's kind of a long process. It's not unusual for a book to take from the time that a publisher says, yes, let's do this, to the point that it's in the marketplace and someone's actually reading it. That can be if it's fast, 12 months, not unusual, 18 months, but also not crazy unusual. It could be 24 months or longer.
Sure.
And it feels like when I think about some of the things that you're talking about, whether it's restraint or speed or I don't know if inexpensive fits along with that. It seems like one of my frustrations with book publishing is that those qualities that I just described, I think, impact the ability for books to be successful. We increase risk the longer it takes for a book to get out. We do all sorts of things. So what's your sort of first thought or first response to that idea of taking this body of knowledge that you've worked with in, I would argue, more complicated systems than a book, but
sure.
What's your first pass at what could be done better or differently, or maybe there's nothing that's lost? I don't know.
No, I think you're right. And I did think about a lot of these things, like, I've got a background in Lean and Agile and Six Sigma and Lean Startup and all these different methodologies for increasing throughput and rapid innovation methods. And really rapid innovation methods is the heart of the F.I.R.E book. So as I was writing the book, I was trying to think, how can I apply what I'm writing to my process of writing? Mm-hmm. And I think there are some parallels here. When you look at within technology, a lot of this idea of rapid innovation, the key is iterations. It's incremental delivery of things. So you deliver what in the Lean Startup, Eric Ries calls the MVP, the minimum viable product. You put that first iteration out. The purpose of doing these MVPs, these minimum viable products, is to get validated learning, to test your hypotheses, to say, is this a quality path? This is a reasonable path to go down, or should I pivot? Should I try doing something else? And I think for a writer, the MVP of a book is an article. And so I mentioned before, I started off writing magazine articles, and I published probably, I think I stopped counting right around 80 or 90. But I was just constantly writing articles, and each article was an experiment. Each article was a little MVP to help me find my voice, to help me find my audience, to help me explore different ideas, and just sort of to find my message. And so although I didn't deliberately set out to say I'm going to write a series of articles to find my voice, my audience, my message, and each one's going to be an MVP, and eventually it will culminate in a book, I think you can't really plan that out. But looking back, that does seem to be the pattern that I was following. And similarly with technology, sometimes we put out a prototype, and we just say we're going to try it. We're going to see what happens. This is an experiment. We're going to gather some validated learning from it and decide what's our next step. And although you can't always predict the whole path, you can sort of, it's like what they say, driving in the dark. Your headlights only show you the next 20 feet in front of you, but you can make the whole trip that way. And I think the same kind of thing happens with iterations, whether we're talking about technology or writing. So yes, and I probably could have, if I had wanted to, written the book earlier than I did, just based on some of the earlier articles. But each one, I really did feel like each article was an experiment. Each one was an MVP, and each one was part of an iterative process, an iterative storytelling experience that eventually led to, hey, I think I've got enough conceptually here to write this new book. And the book wasn't just a collection of articles, but the book echoes a lot of the themes and built on a lot of the themes that I had established in my earlier work.
No, I think that's great. I think so I'm interested. The side that you talked about there, I think, was they intersect, but on one side, I think you have product risks. Is the message it's really, have you found the right problem, and is what you're writing, as in the book or the article, whatever the case might be, are you doing a good job of identifying that problem and then providing a solution that would be really helpful to the reader?
Sure.
I think there's another kind of risk in particular with books, which has to do with, are you doing a good job of reducing your risk of finding customers for what you do? Because it's almost commercial risk, right? It's the idea of, am I going to find people who will find this work interesting? And if I'm treating my book like a startup, can I find customers? Does that then support the book economically, and all the other ways we want to have it happen? So I guess the second question I would ask would be, like I said, they're intermingled, but
sure.
What sort of work did you do in trying to find your way towards growing the audience for what you do and the kind of work that you wanted to talk about extensively?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And a lot of that did get back to those early articles, because I said I was honing my message and finding my voice, but also finding my audience, finding like who out there resonates with this. And so as I expanded the different outlets I was writing for and wrote for outlets that had larger and larger audiences, began to get feedback and letters from readers, and people would send me notes and things, and that began to help confirm the fact that there's more than just my mom reading this stuff. There are actually people in the world who are responding to this and resonating with it. And sort of in parallel with writing, I did a lot of speaking, a lot of presentations at conferences and just different opportunities to get up in front of an audience and say some words. And so that was another way to kind of identify the audience or the customers, people who might theoretically write a book. And at some point, people start asking, hey, did you ever write a book, Dan? Hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? There's some stuff here that might be book worthy. And in fact, I said, I didn't plan this out. I started writing articles just for my own amusement, for my own mental thought experiments. It didn't really occur to me to write a book until a couple of people suggested, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? I thought, well, I like writing, and there is such a thing as people who write books. Maybe I could be one of them. So maybe if some people had mentioned that earlier, I might have tried it earlier and shortened the time. People ask, how long did it take to write the book? And my answer is somewhere between 10 years and 4 months.
Right.
The research took about 10 years, and the life experience, but the actual sitting down at a desk, putting pen to paper, and I do write with pen on paper. I tend to compose in a notebook. That process was about 4 months. Then you send it into the publishing churn, and the editors and the copy editors, they all do their magic. And so it is I think it was about 12 months altogether. But the actual writing process of these words in this arrangement came together in about 4 months. And so that's one of the other principles that I write about in the F.I.R.E. book, is that in order to finish early, the key is to start early. I like to talk about start before you start. So I sat down and I wrote this book in 4 months. That's pretty fast, it felt like.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree.
So the reason I was able to write it so quickly in that 4 months is because I had 10 years of research and experience to draw on. So it all flowed fairly quickly. Quickly within the span of when we start the clock and when we stop the clock. And that's the other big nuance in all of this when we talk about going fast. It kind of depends on when you choose to say the clock starts here and the clock stops there. But again, if we say we are going to start, we finish early by starting early. We kind of start before we start. We do the pre-work, the prep work. that's, I think, a big accelerant to help things move along faster, both in terms of the writing and the idea generation and building the customers.
Perfect.